Chapter 3, we're going to start at verse 22. After this, and you always have to figure out after what? Well, after this conversation with Nicodemus. It's been a couple of weeks, so you may not remember, but they had a conversation in which Jesus helped explain to Nicodemus that you must be born again. We talked about the physical birth and the spiritual birth. It's in that context of Jesus explaining this physical birth that makes us alive physically, but we're still dead spiritually. So we have to be born again spiritually. It's in that context that we get that famous verse, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Excuse me. And so in that conversation, Jesus begins to explain his purpose in coming. We understand that he came to bring life, not to condemn us, but to bring that opportunity for eternal life. And he ends that conversation with kind of this talk about light and dark again. That's a common phrase in John. It's a key phrase that we see come up over and over. The difference between dark and light. And so then after this conversation about the whole purpose of his coming, Jesus and his disciples went into the Judean countryside, and he remained there with them and was baptizing. What we find out in chapter 4 at verse 1 is that even though John just said he was baptizing, really that means he was overseeing the baptisms. You see in verse 1 of chapter 4, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, and then parenthesis, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples. So we learned that when John says in verse 22 that Jesus and his disciples were in the countryside, he remained there and was baptizing. The disciples were doing the baptizing under Jesus' authority, as Jesus was the supervisor. Can you imagine if Jesus had baptized some? As the church began to grow, as the new church got started, can you imagine? I was baptized by Jesus. You were baptized by Paul or Peter or one of those guys, but I was baptized by Jesus. Matter of fact, Paul has to address the church at Corinth for that very thing. Some of y'all are bragging because you were baptized by Apollos. Some of y'all are bragging because you like Paul. Some of y'all are bragging, saying that you're not of either one of them, you're of Christ. Well, stop coming up with all these names and divisions, and they were picking their favorite preacher. All right, after this, Jesus and his disciples went into the Judean countryside. He remained there with them and was baptizing. John also was baptizing at Enon near Salim. Now that's a hard place to find on a map. We don't have good enough records to know where that was. And so that's one of the reasons I didn't bring in my marker board map tonight, because I didn't want to have to demonstrate to you that I don't have a clue where this place is. But we know water was plentiful there, so we assume that it was a wide spot in the river. People were coming and being baptized, for John had not yet been put in prison. That happens very early in Jesus' ministry. Jesus gets started, and almost right away, John gets arrested. And so, the significance of that little parenthetical phrase in 24 is that it's showing us that there was a short overlap. John came first, a voice crying in the wilderness, Messiah is coming. Jesus came, and there was a short overlap of the two ministries. And then very quickly, John is arrested and winds up being beheaded. But this is in that short overlap. And that's significant because it leads to the whole point of the story, and that is that John the Baptist and Jesus are in the same area, reaching the same people, and to some it might look like a competition. Verse 25, now a discussion arose between some of John's disciples and a Jew over purification. For one thing, we don't know who the Jew was. Some translations even use a plural there, that his disciples got into an argument with some Jews over purification. We don't know who was involved. We also don't know specifically what it was they were arguing about. You'll remember that God gave His people the law in the Old Testament. Remember that there are 400 years between the end of Malachi's prophecies at the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the events described in the New Testament. There's a long time in there. And during that time, the Jewish leaders have created more rules that will help people make sure they don't break the big laws. Well-meaning, it's good. They intend it for good purposes. Here's the big laws. Don't break those. Well, how do you do that? Well, let's come up with some rules on everyday Jewish life that will help you make sure you don't even get close to crossing those lines, right? Okay, so we don't know what the rules were that they were arguing over this purification. There were certain rules about purification. It could be so simple as before you eat a meal, you see that as a holy act, as because God is providing the meal for you. And so in order to participate in receiving that from God, first you want to be ceremonially clean. They didn't know they were washing germs. That is not why they washed their hands. But they would wash their hands before a meal as a ceremony, to be ceremonially clean and proper before God, because the food was a gift from God. So there was purification rites that would be that simple just before meals. There were other much more complicated purification rites that were conducted if you were going to present an offering, or if you were going to be at the temple, those kinds of things. So we don't know for sure what the argument was. I do think that it had something to do with the purpose of baptism, because John had been baptizing, now Jesus is starting to baptize, and so there's a Jewish person that has an argument with John's disciples. I'm thinking that he's probably saying, if you do the purification rites that our fathers taught us, you don't really need another bath in the river. I'm guessing that might be the context of the conversation. So whatever the context was, they were arguing over purification. And somehow that leads to a conversation about baptism. So I think that that's probably what they were doing. Verse 26, they came to John and said to him, Rabbi, he who is with you across the Jordan, to whom you bore witness, look, he is baptizing, and all are going to him. You remember back when Jesus got baptized, we noticed that it happened at a place that the name is even called across the Jordan, Bethany across the Jordan. They're saying, when you got this guy started. John's disciples kind of misunderstand what's happening. In their view, as they honor their teacher, their rabbi, they're saying, you got this guy started. When you baptized him across the river, now look what he's doing. He's baptizing. He's taking over your job. And everybody's going to him. There's a little bit of jealousy, competition going on there. Surely we don't have jealousy and competition among ministry leaders in the church today. So it's so easy, I think, for us to fall into that kind of competitive mindset.
Or maybe a false loyalty of some kind.
False loyalty sounds right. Yeah. Like I said, that's what Corinth was dealing with. I follow Apollos' teaching. I follow Paul's teaching. I follow Jesus' teaching. I'm better. This happens for us so easily. That when they came to John, they said, Rabbi, he who was with you across the Jordan, you got his starting. You got him started. He who was with you, to whom you bore witness. Look, he is baptizing. It's not Jesus the Baptist, it's John the Baptist. And now Jesus is doing your thing. And there's a little bit of hyperbole here, and all are going to him. We know it's not really all, because it said John was baptizing and Jesus was baptizing. But it does feel like that sometimes, doesn't it? When things aren't going right, we think in hyperbole. And they're saying everybody's going to him. Everybody in the county is going to Harris Creek Church now. John answered, a person cannot receive even one thing unless it is given him from heaven. The first blank on your paper, if you like to do the blank things, is that John shows us the importance of having proper theology. He has proper theology. He understands who God is, and he understands that anything we have is from him. John gets it. His disciples don't quite get it. So his disciples are saying, John, this is about you. The river is your territory. Jesus is supposed to be over there building cribs for babies and building cabinets. He's a carpenter. The river's your lane. He needs to stay in his lane. This is yours. And John says, you don't understand. Anything I have came from God. This is not about John the Baptist. This is about God. He had a proper theology. James reminds us of that later in the New Testament, in the book of James. He says, all good and perfect gifts come from above. Everything we have has come from God. If you and I could live with that kind of theology, it would help us immensely, because we would live with open hands. So often we have our stuff, and it's our stuff, and don't touch my stuff. This is my stuff. It is hard to share a Dr. Pepper, I can tell. But if I could remember that God gave me everything I have, then I could hold it with a little lighter grip. Right? I don't identify myself with my stuff if I know what I have came from him. I don't wrap my whole identity in my job or my title or my stuff, my lane. John shows us the importance of having a proper theology. And then he shows us the importance of having a proper view of self. Look at verse 28. You yourselves bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. He said, disciples, and remember, he has his own disciples. He's not talking to the 12. He's talking to his disciples. He said, guys, y'all remember, bear witness. Think about it. Remember, I told you that I didn't come for me, but I came for him. I told you that I came to bear witness of the one who was coming after me. I am not the Christ, but I've been sent before him. John had a proper view of self. He knew that he was not all that important. His purpose in life was to point people to Jesus. By the way, I could argue quite effectively that that is your purpose as well. Now, your job might be working here, working there. Your passion might be doing this, doing that. But your primary, your ultimate purpose in life is to point people to God, is to point people in his direction. John understood the proper view of self. So often we teach and preach and think God is here for me. And when we do that, we've messed up those first two things. We don't have the proper theology, and we don't have the proper view of self. It's not that God is here for me primarily. Ultimately, it is, I am here to serve God. It's not what can he do for me, it's how can my life count for his glory. The one who had, verse 28, you yourselves bear witness, I am not the Christ, but one who sent before him. So he has a proper view of self. He knows that he's not as important as Jesus. 29, he has a proper attitude. The one who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is now complete. Can you imagine a wedding where the best man stands off to the side and he's thinking, why does this guy get a bride? Why does he get to get married? I deserve a bride. How come I don't get to have a party? Why does he get to do it? So John says, no, the groom gets the bride, and the best man is happy for him. He's excited for him. John the Baptist says to his disciples, there's no competition here. I don't have a problem with Jesus baptizing people. I'm overjoyed when I get to see that. That's the whole point of this whole thing. The reason I'm here. This is a good thing that the bridegroom is finally being introduced to the bride and the bride to the bridegroom, and I'm getting to watch it. This is cool. Right? Yes. John shows us the importance of having proper theology in 27 when he says, everything I have comes from God. He has the proper view of self when he says in verse 28, I told you that I'm just here to point people to Jesus. He has the proper attitude when he says, I'm not in competition with Jesus. I rejoice when I get to see what he's doing. He says, my joy is complete. And then in verse 30, he has the proper relationship. Look at verse 30. He must increase. I must decrease. That was for him and is for us, the proper relationship with Jesus. He must continually increase. I must continually decrease. We would call that the process of sanctification. Over time, I become more and more like Jesus. He increases in my life, and I decrease. Over time, my priorities become more and more of really his priorities. I'm saying that probably backwards. His priorities are more important than my priorities, right? Who He is, what He wants, that becomes more and more important in my life. Who I am, what I want, becomes less and less important in my life. The proper relationship with Jesus. John shows us the importance of that kind of relationship. He then goes, after he makes this point that when I see Jesus doing His thing, that makes my joy complete because He must increase, I must decrease. And by the way, in a literal way, that is exactly what happened. Jesus' influence continued to increase exponentially, and John's decreased almost immediately. So in a literal way, that is exactly what happened. And based on that conversation then, He must increase, I must decrease, He then shows us why we should trust Jesus. And when I say trust Jesus, in this context, I don't mean trust in, like believe in, but trust what He says. Believe what He says. Why should we do that? By the way, there's a lot of discussion on this next paragraph, verses 31 through 36, as to who actually is speaking here. And some of your versions will have quotation marks around 31 through 36, implying that John the Baptist is still the speaker. The ESV does not have those quotation marks, and I think they got it right. I think in this paragraph, this is no longer John the Baptist teaching. I think this is John, the gospel writer, the one who wrote the book, is now commenting on the statements that John the Baptist just made. And so he says, "He who comes from above is above all." Why would John the Baptist point people to Jesus? Why would John the Baptist say He must increase, I must decrease? Why would John the Baptist be joyful when Jesus is drawing the crowds? John the gospel writer tells us, because He who comes from above is above all. He who is of the earth belongs to the earth and speaks in an earthly way. He who comes from heaven is above all. So John the evangelist, we call him, the gospel writer, says to us, first of all, the reason we should trust Jesus is because He comes from heaven. John the Baptist is from earth, so he talks about earthly things, and his context and his authority is bound to earth. But Jesus comes from heaven. Those are your first two little lines there, your little blanks. Since He comes from heaven, we can trust what He says. He comes at this from an entirely different perspective. He goes on then in verse 32, He bears witness to what He has seen and heard, yet no one receives His testimony. Whoever receives His testimony sets his seal to this, that God is true. One of the reasons that we should trust Jesus is because He knows the truth firsthand. It says that He bears witness to what He has seen and heard. When John the Baptist talks, he talks about what's going to come. Later on, as the apostles speak and teach, they speak and teach about what they have seen. The prophets spoke about what they saw that would eventually happen. Jesus has lived it. He has seen it from the beginning to the end, by the way. Jesus has experienced all of that. And so He comes with an understanding of the truth firsthand. He bears witness. In other words, He talks about those things that He has seen and heard. No one pays attention to Him, but if someone does pay attention to Him, verse 33, then that person sets his seal to the fact that God is true. We can trust in what Jesus has to say because he knows the truth firsthand. It's not, he didn't get it from someone, he didn't wait to hear it from someone else. He has lived it, he sees it. And then we can trust in what Jesus says because the Father has authorized the Son. We continue there, verse 34. For he whom God has sent utters the words of God, for he gives the Spirit without measure. Verse 34 is another one of those meaningful Trinitarian verses. You can see the Trinity of God represented in that one verse. He whom God has sent. So there is the Father who sent the Son. He whom God has sent utters the words of God, for he gives the Spirit without measure. Notice that when God sent the Son, he didn't withhold the Spirit from him. It gave the Spirit in full measure. Jesus was completely God, even when he walked on the face of the earth. The Father loves the Son and has given all things into his hand. The Father has authorized the Son. Therefore, we can trust what Jesus has to say. And finally, whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Whoever does not obey the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God remains on him. We should trust Jesus because we can escape God's wrath. Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Whoever does not obey the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God remains on him. When we trust in what Jesus says about himself and about life, about God, then we can avoid, escape, be removed from the wrath of God. Now, there's a couple of interesting phrases in that verse that I think are significant. He says, whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Usually when we think about eternal life, we think that's going to happen one of these days, right? One of these days when I kick the bucket, when I cross over that last river, I'm gonna have eternal life. But notice he uses the present tense. When we come to Christ, when we really trust him, whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. We need to stop thinking about eternal life as something somewhere else in the future. Eternal life has begun here. Jesus says elsewhere in John, the thief comes to steal and to kill and to destroy, but I have come that you may have life and have it more abundantly. Eternal doesn't mean that it has a beginning later. Eternal means that it is eternal, no beginning, no end. I get to be a part of that life now, even here.